Hey friend, listen. I know the world is scary right now. Corruption, war, inflation, demographics, degeneracy, disease, unrest, hatred, and despair. We didn't come here to tell you how it is, but that it's going to get way better.
Got a good thing coming, and it's all I need. Everything I wanted, so wait and see.
Better by Bitcoin.
Good morning. Welcome to Better by Bitcoin. You have myself and Cypherpunk City and Gilded Plebe on
Morning.
this one. How are you doing, brother?
Doing good, man. Yourself?
Good.
Straight chilling.
Straight chilling. Got a good run in. I had a thing with my foot. I went running last Wednesday and I had to stop halfway through. And naturally, the guys I was with made fun of me, as any good friends would. But then I took a week to rest up and do a lot of lacrosse ball. If you guys have not done this yet, lacrosse ball on the foot is actually a great way to stretch it out. But yeah, that's been my last week. And then also coming off of a bunch of sickness. The whole family was sick, which was kind of a bummer. So
Same.
So this week, I'm trying to talk about morality in code. I think there's been a lot of kind of discussion around this topic, and I just wanted to get kind of your take to kind of tee it up, but then also just kind of like unpack this whole idea, because it's really, I think, challenging, especially with the like religious discourse that's going on just in general, like around the country with, whether it be Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism, whatever it is. Like, there's the religious aspect of this, but I think there's a big disconnect from my perspective, and I'd be curious your take on this to tee it up, of like the core V knots, and then just in general the Bitcoin discourse right now is morality versus decisions that are devoid of morals or amoral decisions. And I'm curious your take on, is an amoral decision possible? Like, is that even possible? Like, I'm curious your take on this.
So, I mean, it would probably be helpful to try and like steelman the alternate view, which basically says, you honestly, you'd probably be better at steelmanning it, but I'm going to try and steelman it, which basically says code is just it's information, it's data, it's just out there. It doesn't have any agency, and therefore it can't do anything. Like it just is, right? Like, and people will look at that, especially people in Bitcoin or cypherpunks will look at this, oh, code just is, and they'll draw a like a philosophical, high level or philosophical or metaphysical conclusion from that basically says, oh yeah, I don't have to have any moral commitments by running this code. I don't have to participate in XYZ thing. Like, I can have my own beliefs, and then the code, which is amoral and just exists as it exists, that's just out there. Now, I don't know if that's a proper steelman of that position. Do you agree? Do you think people frame it differently? Like, what's your interaction with this?
I think that's a good distinction of like kind of like the problem with the discourse right now is like the problem with the discourse as I see it is what you're saying, but I think the bigger piece is there's this growing chasm where people are like, the code is amoral, the code is amoral, the code is amoral, and running the code is amoral. And that is where I think it's the first trip up in the entire argument, which is, oh, thanks, son. The decision to run the code was a moral decision of some way, shape, or form. And what the code says is, and how the code runs is also a moral decision that was made because the people who wrote the code had a moral framework with which they perceived and created and generated and moved the code, right? Like the steelmanning it on the other side is, Satoshi was altruistic in creating Bitcoin and gifting it to the world, right? that is interesting, but then you have to come back to, okay, well, what was driving his altruism and what makes the decision altruistic, right? Like, is altruism a natural bent of nature, or is altruism a decision with which you have to look at things through? Because if altruism is the baseline, that could be the case, right? If altruism is the baseline, then altruism is just natural. But then you have to make the presupposition that if altruism is just natural, then altruism would be the bias of all things. And when you really look at it, if altruism were natural, no one would ever drown. Because if altruism were natural, then if somebody's drowning, water would push them out of the water so they wouldn't drown, right? And so, like, I think this is the challenge that I've just seen with this whole argument with Corby Knots is everybody's like, you know, the I think the biggest challenge I've seen of late was somebody was saying, um, everybody, all the Nazis are saying that Bitcoin was going to die as soon as V30 went out. And like, one, I haven't seen that argument. I've seen that Bitcoin will eventually die because of V30, which I do believe to be mostly correct. Because the death will be, the eventual heat death of the world, right? Is the sun will supernova and then the world is just going to explode. And that's an eventual thing that will happen. Like that is a mathematical certainty because of physics. Is the sun will eventually supernova and everything in our galaxy and universe will die. Yep, correct. But or I guess not universe, but like our specific set of things. But the point with this argument from the Knots perspective is you cannot deny the natural reality of things. And so I guess that's the piece is, and I'm rambling, but the moral of the story here is there is a natural baseline of things, and this piece of code is amoral, has a presupposition of like, okay, so then that means nature is amoral. But I would argue that if you look at nature is that is actually incorrect, because nature serves the purpose with which it was created to serve. Atoms and electrons and neutrons operate in a specific way that they were created to serve. And so then if that is correct, then you must also look at, okay, well, then the code that was created must operate in the same way that it was created to serve, which has a bent, whether that bent was trying to be devoid of morals or was created with morals. Like, and you can't separate those two. And so then if that is true, you can't separate what it was created to do from what it is doing, then you have to deduce, okay, well, I want it to do this thing in the future. And maybe there's a basis of understanding from which I should probably teach people to use this thing correctly. And that is actually the foundation of the Knots argument, which is it's probably a good idea to show people how to use Bitcoin properly. And CSAM is not that thing. I think CSAM is the worst argument, by the way, but I think it is reasonable within that context of this was created to do this thing. We should probably teach people how to use it in the same way guns are created to do a thing. We should probably teach people the correct and incorrect way to use guns. Does that make sense?
A little bit,
Little
not,
rambly.
a little bit. Yes. Yeah. A little rambly. One of the things, but it's sparking some ideas in my head. One of the things that I've been experiencing with this debate is, and I've you can go on Twitter and follow this, but I think there's two interesting corollaries that are coming out of it, which is that we're butting into the is ought problem, which we'll get into in a second, and then also call it like a ethical naturalism or natural ethics. But they're very intertwined and related, and people will kind of use them in very interesting ways. But between these two things, there arises this third thing, which basically says a thing's purpose can be emergent, which is a very like evolutionary kind of like ambiguous, weird thing. But we'll get to that last. The first thing is the is-ought problem. So the is-ought problem was first formulated by David Hume in 1770 something or something, but something. But it's a really fantastic. It's called Hume's guillotine, but it's a really fantastic thing. Basically, Hume said that you cannot draw an ought from an is without additional presuppositions. So if I look at a thing and I say that and I can see that it's orange. Okay, so this thing is orange. This is the reality of this thing is orange. But I can't then jump and say this thing ought to be orange because it's orange without the presupposition of, in this case, it'd be ethical naturalism. It is what it is, and therefore it should be that way, right? Because I could also just say it is orange, but it ought to be blue because somebody dumped orange paint on it and it was originally blue. It needs to be blue, right? So there's a real problem with drawing ethical moral reality from a thing just by observing it and just by stating its is. Here's in the case of Bitcoin directly applies. Here's the nature of Bitcoin. This is what it is, which is it is a database that can store data, arbitrary data in various ways, and you can do all this stuff to put the arbitrary data in there. And there's a specific requirement of the Bitcoin system that allows user-defined private keys. Consequently, that means there's excess entropy in the user definitions of how they are required to interact with the system, which means that arbitrary data cannot be stopped. It's a part of Bitcoin's fundamentalness, right? And the reality of that is that people will then apply ethical naturalism and say, well, that is how Bitcoin ought to be. It ought to be a data storage layer because that's what it is, right? But that's the Hume razor takes the jump and basically, or you're basically making a jump and you're applying an ethical framework to it. And the ethical framework is ethical naturalism. Things ought to do or ought to continue in the way that they are. And that's just a moral, that's you imposing your morals onto the system, not actually drawing your morals from the system, which is a lot of the confusion about this, because people they look at Bitcoin, they elevate it to a place where it's not strong enough to be somebody's moral backbone. It's like, but they don't have a better moral backbone, so they just say, oh, we're just going to point to Bitcoin and say that's a really strong moral, like, oh, look at it, it's unchangeable, that's truth. Like, wow, we can point to that and say this is what morality should look like. And but really all that is doing is just you guys, humans have been around for thousands of years arguing over what a moral and immoral thing to do is, and just drawing your morality because of some new technology is like, I don't know, anti-fragile in so many, or no, not anti-fragile in so many ways.
Yeah.
So is that all tracking so far?
That's totally tracking. I've never heard this Hume's guillotine idea, but I actually really think there's something interesting in that. Of like, what it sparked for me is like Hume's guillotine is ought, is are facts, oughts are theories, right? Theories can be tested and changed. Is are just constants that are. This is a
Maybe.
rock. Well, but walk with me here.
Sure.
So the point of this is, and I guess it's even like, as I'm like positing this through, there are very few ises. If I'm even going through, like, time is a constant, period. Like, time is one of the only things, as far as we know, time travel doesn't exist. I think theoretically it does, but like, as far as we know, it is like, as far as we know, time travel. I mean, hey, I've seen all the Barron Trump and the Trump things, and the I've seen Josh Mandel, but the interesting thing that was sparked for me about this Hume's guillotine is you need to keep looking back at the ought to keep something righted into the future, unless you want it to change. And so what I mean by that, there's a bunch of like kiddie cones that we have for like my kids to play soccer, right? These little like orange things. And they were left in the sun, and this cone is orange, was correct for a period of time. But because it was left in the sun, it is now clear or white, right? Both of those are correct. And in the beginning, if you didn't have an understanding of what it was, you could have the understanding of like, oh no, it is orange, but you could have been like, no, it is white, like it is clear, which if you're using the guillotine would have been correct if we're trying to jump to the end of, oh, if you left it out in the sun, it is going to become this. And so I think what's interesting here is we're kind of at this point with the Bitcoin Knots core debate of people are kind of trying to jump to the end. They're trying to jump to the 2200 where Bitcoin is just an arbitrary data storage. But the challenge is that is incorrect if your belief is it ought to be money. And ought things are actually conditioned things. Like you need to train somebody. You ought to be a moral person. You ought to not kill people. You ought to not do these things that are perceived to be evil, which is something that fits within a moral framework. Like, somebody is a human, right? But that human ought to act a certain way. Just because you is a human doesn't mean that you is going to do things in a particular way. And so I think that's the challenge here is, the code is what it is, correct, but just because the code is what it is, that doesn't mean, you can is somebody into interacting with it in a particular way.
Yeah. There's when you apply an ought, you apply steering. When you say, if you apply that there's ethical naturalism, that's where we want to go. It is what it is, and that's what it should be doing. You're steering in that direction. So, hey, the fundamental nature of Bitcoin requires that it has arbitrary data because of excess entropy that's required in the system. Therefore, it ought to accommodate arbitrary data, right? But that's the conclusion from ethical naturalism. But a different moral framework would say, oh, well, no. Bitcoin is money as its first and primary purpose. And therefore, it ought to not store arbitrary data, or it ought to limit as much arbitrary data as it can while retaining its core functionality as money, aka retaining that excess entropy set, but limiting the way in which it's being abused or misused for spam and whatever else whatever anybody else wants to put on the chain, right?
Mm-hmm.
So these are teleological directions that are at odds with each other, and it stems from a moral premise. One moral premise is we need a just and sound money. Bitcoin fulfills that purpose. It's impossible, and humanity's been around for a long time. It's impossible to do it any other way apart from Bitcoin that we know of. And therefore, if we need a just and sound money, which many people would assert that we do, therefore we need Bitcoin to be that just and sound money. And therefore, Bitcoin ought to move in the direction of just and sound money as a primary fundamental purpose, as its teleological direction, morally aligned, teleologically aligned, efficaciously aligned, and then you jump into usefulness and the subjectivity and how it should be applied and what we can do with it and all the rest of it.
Mm-hmm.
But if you start from ethical naturalism, you basically say, well, it's this thing and it is what it is, and so then we're just going to push it in random directions. That it's money, so we want to push it in the money direction, but also it's data storage, we want to push it in the data storage direction, and it's goofiness. It literally jumps. It's the exact same thing. The exact same argument as evolution, right? Where we just evolve. Like what's our purpose? There is no real ethical, moral framework, anything, because we don't really have a purpose. Our purpose kind of it is what it is. We're here because we're here. Like there's no like I can go this way or that way, or like, oh yeah, this is fun. This hurt me a lot. Like there's no real like guiding force or kind of like a directionality to anything. It all just collapses into meaninglessness.
Mm. Yeah, that like the core argument has always been Darwinistic in my mind. Like,
yeah,
you have this idea that Bitcoin should just be able to survive regardless. Like the whole thought that everybody keeps saying is like Bitcoin is just going to win. No, it's not. Like in the same way, the lion that's out, on the African Sahara is not just going to be the king of the jungle. Like there are other forces at play always. Everything is a decision, and you ought to make the best decision possible, because if you are not, you is gonna die. Period. Like there is a reason that going 500 miles an hour in a car on a highway that's twisty is not a good idea, right? Like this is the fundamental thing that's a challenge to me with the core argument is you can let people play in the sandbox. I'm totally fine with letting people play in the sandbox, but that doesn't mean you take away all of the walls of the sandbox, because then you don't have a sandbox, you have a beach, right?
Yeah. Or it doesn't mean you turn the house into a sandbox. Like it's like, no, you keep the sandbox a sandbox, right?
Correct. And it's the same thing with a sandbox. It's like, hey, this is a sandbox. It's not a litter box. Like there's a difference between a sandbox and a litter box. Both of them have sand at the bottom, right? Like that is a true statement. Like there is sand in the bottom of the sandbox, and there is sand roughly in the bottom of the litter box, but that doesn't mean, the sandbox is a litter box. And that's the challenge that I've had with this whole thing is, the relativistic argument of everything should be allowed is misguided, because there is nothing in life that I'm aware of where everything is allowed.
Mm-hmm.
Period. Like everything in life is allowed. Correct. I get it. But that doesn't mean everything is correct. Because if you're going to ever make a moral presupposition about anything, like if you're an assassin, right? Assassins kill people because their moral framework says, I'm doing this for money, and they've made the act of killing devoid of any feeling, right? Is in their mind doing this thing for money to provide for themselves a lifestyle that they want in some way, shape, or form. That is their moral code. Their moral code is the acquisition of money is greater than the preservation of life. That is a moral code. And so there is a thing there you can say, oh, it's like, oh, they're amoral. It's like, no. They're not amoral. They have made a moral decision. And within their moral framework, life is not valued to the same degree as money. And that's fine. Or stuff, or in any way, shape, or form, right? Or, revenge, right? Let's say it's just a revenge assassination, right? This is the bigger challenge in this whole thing is you must pick a side. And in the long term, my belief, and I'd be curious on this, like in the long term, the choose no side decision is a Darwinistic decision, because it's kind of like you're sitting on you're sitting in a self-driving car that you've not vetted, and you're going 1,000 miles an hour, and you're like, it's fine. It's literally the meme of the guy sitting in the house on fire, the dog sitting in the house on fire. It's like, this is fine. It's like, no, eventually that house is going to burn down, and there's going to be problems. And so it's like, you got to make a decision of, hey, do you take that cup of coffee, you start putting out the fires, or do you start like just getting out of the house, right? And so this is the thing, is like the indecision, right? And in this case, they're making decisions to actively make Bitcoin ought to be a database. And so yeah, that's the challenge that I have, is like, no, it ought to be money, and we ought to do everything we can to preserve that distinction between money and database. That's my take.
Yeah, there's a real, I mean, I got into an argument with Vortex over this, but there's a real sense of the ethical naturalism taken to this like crazy degree where it's so presupposed that it makes everything else like impossible to even comprehend. One instance of it would be someone presupposes ethical naturalism, which is to say everything is what it is and it's all neutral. There's no moral. This is how it is, right? There's no moral implication for anything. But then you like directly apply that to any human-made artifact, Bitcoin included, and then they immediately believe that, oh, it's just code. It just is what it is, and there's no ethical anything baked into that. It's what humans like. It's how humans use it, or how humans apply it, or how humans blah blah blah. But there's no actual like ethic. It's all neutral. The thing itself is neutral. And you're like, no, the thing itself is not neutral. It's explicitly designed, in the case of Bitcoin, explicitly designed for the purpose of, for instance, having a strict monetary hard base. So no inflation. Because of that decision, because of that bias towards no inflation, we can assume, we can say that Bitcoin is aligned with a moral framework that doesn't want inflation, right? But if Bitcoin had been designed to have inflation, well, then it would have been aligned with a moral framework that allows for and that works with and understands inflation as good, right? But it didn't choose those things. You can't choose both of those things at the same time. You can't both have inflation and no inflation. And so Bitcoin itself, just the code, is not neutral. And when you start at ethical naturalism and then work its way to like, oh, and then make declarative statements that like this is neutral, it's bogus. It's like so self-refutingly bogus.
I'll make the steel man of the other side, right? And let me try to, because I've been thinking about this, and I'm like, how do I make the V30 decision make sense? And let me try and do it from a perspective of like trying to be the most unbiased I can. And I think the answer to that is Bitcoin ought to be the most efficient money. Like that's the only way I can potentially try and steelman this from a perspective of like, how do you justify the changes that they made? And if Bitcoin ought to be the most efficient money, there is a case in my mind to make some of these opportune changes, because then, you know, you have L2 possibilities that can make it a more efficient money. I totally actually see that, and I think that is reasonable to say. The challenge I have with that, though, is you come into this issue where we haven't actually defined what is money, right? And that's the whole point of Brelo's podcast. And what is efficient? What do those words mean? And I think that's the challenge that we have with this, is nobody's actually put a stake in the ground. Like outside of Luke, who's been very active in a lot of these different pieces, I don't think liar is an effective thing to say when you're in a discourse. But
correct, yeah.
I think the issue becomes, you know, we have a document, the white paper, that kind of outlines a piece of software that does some really cool things in the moral realm when it comes specifically to money and what people trade their time for. But we don't have a follow-up document, which is honestly what I think is actually more important than even BIP 444. Like we need a mutually, communally agreed upon document that people can point to and be like, this is what Bitcoin ought to be. And I think that honestly will solve a lot of these problems, because it's the same thing that you do whenever you're designing anything, right? You know, I run a business and my business ought to run in this particular way. Just because my business is a business does not mean it is going to be successful, right? The way you make something as successful is you make determinations about what you're trying to do, and then you go do that thing. And by the way, you're going to make some mistakes and you're going to, you know, do some incorrect things, you know, SegWit, taprope, whatever it is, that have unintended consequences. Not saying that those things were bad, but they have unintended consequences. And that could be for better or worse, right? Like my understanding of this is very cursory, but like I think Lightning is capable because of some of those changes, but so are dick butts. And so that's the key here, is like you need to make determinations about what this thing ought to be and where we ought to be going in the future. Because if not, we are literally just in a car traveling 1,000 miles an hour down the highway, and there is a brick wall, or there's brick walls everywhere, and we got to figure out which ones do we want to avoid, or which ones do you want to crash right through, or which ones do we not know are actually, you know, black holes of oblivion that we're going to die. And so,
Yes.
yeah.
Correct. I love the we need a document thing. And honestly, like many of my conversations online have kind of like pushed in that direction. And it's pretty clear in my head, like what exactly that document needs to be. It needs to be a, hey, here's a correct way to source teleological purpose, right? Like it needs to hit, and it should be applicable to any. It should be like an engineered document that's applicable to any worldview. Doesn't matter, right? And then here's a correct way to establish a teleological purpose. Here is employing that system. Here's how we can get a teleological purpose for Bitcoin. That teleological purpose results in these directional and definitional ways to look at Bitcoin. The exact thing that you're talking about. Now, we get into this real problem with the first piece. How do we, like, what's a good way to understand a teleological purpose of things? And this is like not an unsolved problem in and of itself. Like if you go to an engineering school that is sufficiently robust in its engineering, you will learn about how to achieve purpose, how to build things to meet their ends, right? You will learn all of this stuff. Now, you might not learn about it at a high philosophical level, but you'll have like a very good tool set that allows you to like actually make decisions in terms of, does this meet the goal we're trying to meet? You know, what are the feedback loops? Where's the errors, scenarios? How do we adjust and test and all the rest of it? Like all of that is like super important to inform directionality and where things should go in the future, how things should change in the system, how do we protect the system? Like it defines all of it. Like, oh yeah, this is clearly spam. Look at the definition. Like, great, we have a definition for spam. This is clearly spam. It meets the definition. Now we are engineering a way to mitigate spam, right? Like this is a very clear, or it should be a very clear delineation about how this should function and how it should actually attack and solve real problems. Now, the issue we're facing is the moral relativism problem of like, well, how do you decide telos? Well, you know, like whatever, you know, like just whatever. Like, oh yeah, I mean, whatever. Like, you know, that's good for you. Whatever's good for you is good for you. Like, let's do that, right? But it's like that's not an actual good way to solve any problem. That's just philosophical garbage, just trash, right? And then, oh, what's the next step? The next step is, oh, okay, let's use this system of trash to define what Bitcoin should be. Well, Bitcoin should just be trash. Like we're just, oh yeah, trash is garbage in, garbage out. It's just trash all the way through. Okay. So it doesn't matter what Bitcoin is or should be. Like we're just going to kind of pull from the ether about what this, like, oh yeah, look, it does this. It's just data. Oh, okay. So it's just data. Like we'll just do the data thing. Oh, you know, like, and you can clearly see how this affects, like, oh, op return. Well, Bitcoin is this system that needs a mempool, and so we need to optimize the mempool and make sure everyone's mempool is the same, so we don't incentivize miners to blah blah blah. Therefore, let's expand the default for op return, but without the higher purpose of like Bitcoin is money. Well, what are you doing when you're expanding the op return thing? You're creating pathways for Bitcoin to be attacked more efficiently. And you're like, wait a second, what's more important? That the mempool is uniform across all nodes all the time, which was like never, ever a possibility, even in the remotest anyway, from the beginning.
Centralizing. Yep.
And centralizing. Or that like we expose Bitcoin to existential threats. Like, guys, it's obvious that the big thing that you should be focusing on is mitigating or eliminating existential threats, and then working on the small optimizations within the system.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think of this now, and I'm trying to figure out what the, you know, I feel like at the beginning of every single, like the future pushes for the code, there needs to be a one sentence delineator of like a hard check. And so what I mean by that is, it needs to be something to the effect of like, Bitcoin is something to the effect like, Bitcoin is irrefutably the most finite and trusted store of value in the world, or whatever it is, right? Like I don't know what that is. I'm just, again, like pitching this in the room, but there needs to be a way to define what money is, because and what Bitcoin is, because that delineator will solve the problems you're just talking about, right? Garbage in, garbage out is a technical term that applies to everything. Like if I have bad data, I'm going to get bad data on the other side. If I have a bad product, I'm going to get a bad result on the other side. And so this is the challenge we've kind of come up against, and it's good right now that this debate is happening now, right? Bitcoin is a growing, burgeoning asset. I'm a noob here, but I understand the power of story. There's a reason people buy this book, right? This is the Bible. But there's a reason people buy this book, because it's a damn good story. Whether or not you're a Christian, right? It's a damn good story. And on top of it being a great story, it's also got a lot of historical precedent and context. It's the most self-referential text in existence. Outside of that, though, the references actually check out from a historical perspective. Like you can go back and if you're just reading it from a purely historical perspective, I think histrionic is the word I'm looking for. But like if you're looking at it just from a purely historical perspective, it's actually the most valuable resource to look at ancient history in existence. And I think that's the thing that's missed with Bitcoin is, like with the Bible, you can look at the story of Christ, or you can look at the story of the Torah, or you can look at all these different aspects of things. You can go back, like even in Islam, like they say Jesus was a real person and this happened. So it's like you even have other religious tech, and also in Judaism, like the Jews go back and like, no, Jesus wasn't the Messiah, but Jesus was a person, right? And so there's this corroboration across different avenues of what the thing ising. Jesus is a person that lived at one point in time. Fact, right? That is not in debate in any way, shape, or form. And so circling that to Bitcoin is a thing that exists now. Fact. But what it ought to be in the future must be discussed, which is where we're at now, and it must be agreed upon for all the people using it. And I think that's kind of this discussion of what's happening. And I'm very kind of like stoked that I get to exist at this time to kind of have part of that, because I think this is the moment that is going to figure out what Bitcoin will become and if it will be successful or not. Because at the end of the day, you just walk this out, just like you were talking about. When you increase the surface area of something, the attack surface area on something, it's only a matter of time before somebody comes along and finds a way to attack it. Period. Like there's a reason Elon Musk has one of the largest security details in the world, because he has a larger attack surface. He's worth $1 trillion essentially at this point. That's a lot more vulnerability from a perspective like people want to attack that. That's not necessarily that they can attack that, right? But the surface is so much bigger that you want to, and so you're going to find ways to do it. And that kind of comes back to this whole point here.
Well, the reward for it is so much bigger. But yeah,
correct. But the reward is bigger, but from a Bitcoin perspective, as number goes up, reward gets bigger, and so you're going to want to attack it. And it's the same thing with Elon. As number goes up, the reward goes up, and so you're going to want to attack it. And so that's the thing here is like you need to be closing doors and creating mazes to protect yourself reasonably. You don't want a Winchester mansion. If Bitcoin becomes a Winchester mansion, but you do want reasonable safeguards in place to protect what you're trying to do. And that's the thing, is that we haven't aligned on what we're trying to do. And that's I think the thing that's the most important thing to align on right now.
I think this bridges into the direction we wanted to kind of take this podcast, which is we have to choose direction. We have to choose Telos. We have to choose, because the choice of, we're just going to have it like, just, hey, whatever, man. That's a choice to enforce a particular view of Bitcoin, a particular view of reality. And the enforcement of that view is just total conflict and total absurdity and garbage in, garbage out, and whatever. Because whatever, man, like whatever. But that's the moral framework, the underpinnings of the system that we are choosing to enforce by making those choices. So you can't not choose. You have to choose a particular system. Okay, well, if you have to choose a system, which we do, you should evaluate each system on its own merits and then choose the best system. This system solves these problems. This system solves these problems, but it has this problem. This system solves none of those other problems, because it removes the surface area for the attack, right? So it doesn't actually solve any of those problems. It just eliminates the whole thing. And you just, look at all the different ways in which you can solve a problem, and or choose your morality or choose the system you want to enforce. But the point is, you cannot not choose. You have to choose. Everybody gets to believe whatever they want, but everybody has to believe something.
Would you agree with this statement, or how would you change this? The argument right now between Core and Knots is a decision tree of two things. It's a decision where the morals are incentive, personal incentive, period, or the morals are shared values, period.
Unpack or give examples for both of those.
From an incentive perspective, and I think this is the core argument is the incentive above all else. If you are able to pay the fee, you are reasonably allowed to do what you want to do. And I wouldn't even, reasonable is even the incorrect word. Is if you are able to pay the fee, you can do whatever you want to do. That's the case that I have heard made from Jameson Lopp standing on stage. How are you going to stop me? Right?
Yeah.
I can pay the fee. How are you going to stop me? That's literally Jameson's point from Jameson's point, his thing. And Luke's point, and again, I'm just picking those two because they're kind of the two biggest ones on the stage on this. But Luke's point is, I have to determine what this thing is, and what I believe it is driving all of my decisions. And so that's a value-based argument of, I believe this thing is a better money and should be a better money. And so all of my decisions are going to go into that. And Jameson's point is, this is whatever I want it to be if I'm willing to pay for it.
Yep. And
so it's incentives, i.e., above all else, if you can pay the incentive, whatever it is, the fee in this case, or whatever it is, the core devs that I can get to do what I want, right? If I can get high enough up on the incentive chain with the people to make the decisions, I can do whatever I want. Whereas Luke's perspective would be, no, the values are more important than the incentive, because Bitcoin is a value-based system. And if you choose to run that, you are actually invoking a set of values, whether you like it or not. And so you actually need to make a distinction of, actually, do you like those values or not?
So it actually is probably worth evaluating, hey, we have to choose which choice, right? So which choice? Let's evaluate those choices. So I know, because I've seen it and believe this at one point as well, but the idea that, fees are the spam mitigation, that's the only thing that matters. And if you can pay the fee, you can participate. Doesn't everything else matters, or everything else doesn't matter? As I understand it, and I could be mistaken on this, but I'm pretty sure Andreas Antonopoulos was the first to really kind of articulate that, or at least articulate it at length in a really coherent manner. Then other people have taken it in other directions. Like, I think Eric Voskuil basically made the argument that there is no spam. If fees are a spam mitigating factor, well, whoever can pay the fee is participating in the system and they get away. So therefore there is no spam. But you take a step back, it's like, well, that's just ethical naturalism. Like, it is what it is, and therefore there is no spam, because it is like, this is how the system's supposed to work and how it's supposed to function anyway. So there is no spam. Andreas Antonopoulos originally formulated this argument in the context of the block war, which is important, because he basically formulated it like so. You either have a fee market that allows everybody to, like, we don't get to judge your transactions as long as you can pay the fee. Great. It's totally, there's no, as he called it, a developer dictatorship that determines what is a valid use case and an invalid use case. Hey, if you can pay the fee, you're valid. Great. And the alternative in Antonopoulos' view was that your if you don't do the fee market, you have this dictatorship of developers, and that dictatorship of developers gets to decide what a valid transaction is. Okay. Which is to say they, write code that looks like, oh, okay, well, this transaction, I don't know about that. So we're going to, in the next release, we're going to say that this transaction's invalid and you can't use that anymore or whatever. And you can kind of see how that's a dictatorship of developers, because then it's just the developers dictating what is and isn't valid on the chain. Okay. So it's important to first evaluate this argument from the context of a block size war where all the blocks were completely full. The fees were up to just crazy high. Something like I remember paying $50 for a transaction at some point. So if you're trying to buy a coffee, it's impossible because the fee itself is whatever that is, 10 times more expensive than the coffee. Okay. So by proposing this argument in this particular way, Antonopoulos then goes on to point to scaling. And you can go watch the videos yourself, but he points to scaling. Like, how do we scale then? Well, we don't want to increase the block size first. Instead, we want to do off-chain scaling, get SegWit, get Lightning, get all this other stuff. So when he's framing this as the fee market versus dictatorship of developers, what he's really doing is just extending an olive branch to this very contentious debate where on one side they wanted to increase the block size and the other side they wanted to do the off-chain scaling, right? So he's actually, if this is an extending an olive branch, everybody can agree that fees are good, right? That's all, like the context basically dictates that that's the argument right there, is that fees are good. He's not saying that they're perfect spam mitigation. He's not going through this philosophical like hoops to articulate that fees basically mean that there is no such thing as spam. So it's important to understand that context. This is going to be a crazy long rant, by the way, and this is all off the hip, but
this is good context for me. Actually, this is one of the things that I keep talking with some people that I'm talking with. I'm like, hey, this historical context is important. Like the Matt Hill thing from Start 9 that was posted like 2 days ago, where he was kind of giving some of this context that you're talking about now. It is actually important for people like me who are new and mildly regarded to have, because perspective, like context matters in decision making. So this is good.
Yeah. Okay. So now there's a for me this one is a little bit silly, but it's also just it's just so obvious to me, right? If it's a true dichotomy, which is how it's being presented, you either have fees mitigating spam or dictatorship of developers mitigating spam. If it's a true dichotomy, then you have to start asking yourself, well, who created the fee market? Was it developers? Because I'm pretty sure it was developers. So that's a problem right there with this dichotomy, right? But on top of that, we'll get into that in a second, but just to put it out there. But on top of that, the fee market, like, how does the fee market run? Well, it runs because we're running software. Okay, well, if the fee market mitigates spam, and the only way to run a fee market is by running software, well, then the syllogism says the only way to mitigate spam is by running software. Whether or not there's a fee market or not, there's a wider range of things you can do to mitigate spam than the fee market, right? Now, are those all dictatorship of developers? Perhaps, but there's more things you can do. I think BIP 444 is an example of that. We don't have to just use fees. We can actually like buckle down and say, no, this is what is and is not spam. Now, I'm not making a stance on BIP 444. I'm just giving an example. That will be software that is not fee related. That will define spam. Okay. So then addressing the dictatorship of developers thing. And like this one for me, like really kind of boggles your mind. If you just accept that this dichotomy is dogmatic, let's call it, like there is either the fees or the developers and there's no in between ground. You also then have to accept, as stated, that the fee market itself was created by developers doing a great job. They did it. Thank God we have a fee market. but it was created by developers, and therefore it instills a dictatorship of developers. And then you go and you look at the people's argument, and I have some of the quotes pulled up here, but like Callie, only transaction fees can reliably fight spam without sacrificing any of Bitcoin's properties. Well, we just established that there's a wider range, like you can run different software, right? So that this all of a sudden reads like a very dogmatic. This is a developer saying something that feels dogmatic, and you're like, how far does this go to explain the perceived gaslighting that non-developers node runners have been feeling in the space? How far does this go in explaining why it feels like we have a dictatorship of developers? Why does it feel like Node is kind of just, it doesn't matter, we're just going to do whatever we want, right? Very interesting, huh? And Lopez quotes, like so many other, there's you could just completely just paper everything with all of the.
One thing that's interesting on this, actually, and it's kind of like bringing to mind, is there is a fundamental gap I've started to realize between what the developers understand and what is actually true. And what I mean by that is Bitcoin developers on both sides have a fundamental misunderstanding of what motivates people. And I'll take the Callie floppy argument for this particular case, right? Callie was, and I'll use the word altruistically, creating a very simple way for people to interact with Fediment, with Cashew. And what Callie missed in this whole thing is, and as a developer, he's really in the weeds with the code, but what he missed is code is not a contract. There is no social contract within the code that it needs to be run a specific way. The code will only run a certain way, but that does not mean somebody is not going to come along and try to poke holes in it, which is what Floppy did, realizing that he could force JPEGs into this. Yeah. And that, I think, is the debate that we're having right now. Is one side is saying, no, the code is a contract, and the other side is saying, no, the code is a pathway, and the contract needs to be created. And I think that's where we're at. It's the whole thing about the United States, right? The United States is not a contract. The Constitution is a document that says this is how you are supposed to act. That is kind of the Knots camp. Or I guess that's probably the core camp in this way. It's like, no, this is the Constitution. This is the rule of law. You have to go this way. And the Knots camp is, yes, but that doesn't mean people are going to act that way. And I think that's the issue here. Is they're looking at the defining document, the code, right? They're looking at it and saying, no, it's the is-ought thing. This is how it works, which is not wrong. It's interesting coming back to the Hume's guillotine. Like, essentially, the core v Knots debate is Hume's guillotine. The core side is saying this is Bitcoin, and the Knot side is saying yes, but it ought to be run this way, and we should tell people that, because if we don't tell people that, they're going to use it incorrectly. That's actually the fundamental piece of this entire thing. Is it's Hume's guillotine, and we're just kind of arguing about the is and the ought. And the problem with the is side is they are fundamentally ignoring humanity and the fact that humans were designed to push up against things.
Yeah. I mean, point of contention, like is ought cuts on both sides. Just I'd say to try and steelman what you're trying to say right now, which is the Knots camp is being upfront and honest about what their ought is, right? So they look at Bitcoin and say, here's what it is, but this is what it ought to be. It ought to be money. Okay. Therefore, we're going to look further down the run. The core camp, some of them are upfront about it. It ought to be a database, but many of them are just the implied ought. This is what it is. it's impossible to fully mitigate spam, period. Therefore, like they don't state their ought. They're not honest with their ought, right? Which their ought is a ethical naturalism ought that says we can't eliminate spam, and therefore we must accommodate data storage.
It is code and it can do whatever it is told to do versus it is code created by humans and it ought to do this thing. Like that is the fundamental difference. I totally agree. Is it is code, and because it is code, it can do this versus it is code created by a human to interact with humans and it ought to be used in this way. Like that is the binary in my mind. And I understand the perspective of Core on this, but I disagree with it because you cannot remove the user from the usage. Like if you just say all humans are humans and so they're going to kill people, I'm just going to use it as a thing. It's like, no, all humans are humans and they ought to not kill people because it's actually a bad thing. Like, sure, they can kill people, but that doesn't mean they should kill people. And it's like, well, you're making a distinction here. It's like, no, I'm just kind of like, oh yes, I am making a distinction here because I think it's the correct thing to do. And I think that's the issue here is they're like, well, because you are a human and you can kill people, then you should be killing people. It's like, no. And that's I think the loop.
Big no.
Big no.
Yeah. So it comes back to how should you choose? Like you have to choose some ought where you can't interact with reality. So which one are you going to choose? You should choose the strongest ought. You should choose the humblest ought. You should choose like the most valuable, like whatever your framework is going to be that allows you to actually like mitigate and differentiate which oughts you ought to choose, right? Like this is why for me it's just so painfully comes back to moral relativism. Like you guys, like just scraping the bottom of the barrel, choose an ought, choose a moral framework that doesn't undermine itself, right? Like if you're going to choose an ought that says Bitcoin is what it is and therefore it ought to be what it is, you are choosing an ought that is simultaneously diametrically opposed to itself, which is I want bigger blocks and I want more storage, and I also want smaller blocks and I want more decentralization because of the necessity of using Bitcoin as a money, right? You want both at the same time, bigger blocks, more storage, and at the same time, smaller blocks, less storage. Like these are completely self-contradictory. Therefore you should be able to just cleanly wipe out a morally relativistic stance on this. Now, I'm not necessarily saying all Core supporters are all just morally relativistic. No. There's a lot of morally relativistic people in the Knots camp too. And I think that's where kind of you get the weird like legal arguments, like, oh, we have to do this because of legal. Well, no, but the legal is just moral relativism all over again because the legal frameworks completely change in whatever jurisdiction you're in. So like, why appeal to that? Right now, there's also some very strong proponents on the Core side that don't have a morally relativistic framework. I haven't necessarily seen many of their arguments, so I'm not going to try and I'm just going to assume that they're there. I'm not going to try and state what their arguments are because I just don't know. But man, choose a good ought, defend it well, like have it meet just basic criteria. Like it doesn't contradict itself. When you apply it to itself, it doesn't spin off into crazy paradoxes. It doesn't, or it can meet standard philosophical requirements. Something like communicability. Like your ought, like I'm going to choose an ought that's like wishy-washy. It's like, well, okay, cool. What's your ought? Well, it's a little wishy-washy. I can't really communicate it well. It's like, well, that's not an ought. That's just instilling yourself as a gatekeeper for what Bitcoin should do. And it's like totally antithetical to so many things, right? Like, oh, I'm just going to install myself as the priest class at Dictatorship of Developers because I just think Bitcoin should just be kind of wishy-washy. It's like, no, it has to be a very communicable, very clear, very robust and attacked aught that can withstand all the attacks that are going to come, because they're going to come, right? We'll just know they're going to come. That's what we're experiencing right now. Bitcoin's aught is being attacked. Ought Bitcoin to be money or ought to be something else? And those things are clearly not aligned. So,
yep. What's your last word? I'll give mine real quick, but in my mind, I think when people look at the history of Bitcoin, the most important thing that ever happened to Bitcoin was being described as magic internet money. Because at the end of the day, it ought to be magic, instantaneous settlement, no clawbacks, internet, something that's decentralized, and money. And I think that story probably did more good for Bitcoin than a lot of people realize.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. I mean, I was just hammer home on my last thoughts was just hammering home on, dude, choose a good moral framework, choose a robust, a not self-refuting, communicable framework, because it's going to get torn apart. It's going to get destroyed if you do not choose a good one. So that's all I got.
Well, thanks everyone. We'll either see you later this week or next.
Peace. Thanks for tuning in to Better by Bitcoin. Bitcoin makes everything better. Like, subscribe, and follow us on X at BetterBYBTC, YouTube at BetterBYBitcoin. Not financial advice, mathematical certainty.